It wasn't the thunder of 100 cannons, nor the relentless chatter of a machine gun that haunted the soldiers. It was something far more intimate, far more chilling. The sound of a single shot. A sharp, definitive crack that echoed across the no-man's land. A sound that turned laughter into silence. This was the weapon that became a legend. A symbol of last-ditch defiance and cold, hard justice. The M1911 pistol, the Colt 45. For a generation of young men who faced the brutal reality of total war, it was the closest thing to a friend they had. A cold steel grip promising a final desperate chance at survival. This was the story of the sidearm that was meant to be a last resort, but became an icon. A character in the grand, bloody drama of World War II, a silent partner to every man who carried it, and a grim witness to their final moments. The air in the training camp hung thick with the smell of canvas, sweat, and cheap coffee. It was 1941, and the world was a powder keg. But for a young private from rural Kansas, it was just the beginning of a long journey. Thomas Miller, a farm boy with a sturdy frame and an earnest face, stood on the firing line, his hands trembling slightly as he held the M1911 for the first time. The cold weight of the pistol was a stark contrast to the warmth of the prairie soil he was used to. His drill sergeant, a grizzled veteran of the Great War, barked out instructions, his voice a gravelly rumble. "This ain't no toy, Miller. This is the last thing you want to use, but the first thing you need to know." He demonstrated the grip, the sight picture, the deliberate press of the trigger. It's a hammer. It's got a kick like a mule, but it'll put a man down and keep him there. Thomas watched, his mind racing. He had heard stories of the 45, of its legendary stopping power, of the myth that a single round could drop a charging man. But to hold it, to feel its undeniable presence, was something else entirely. It was a promise, a grim assurance that even when all was lost, there was still one final card to play. Training was relentless. They practiced drawing the pistol from its holster, a smooth, practiced motion that needed to be second nature. They learned to field strip it, to clean the barrel, to clear a jam with their eyes closed. The pistol became an extension of their hand, a part of their uniform, a constant companion. Thomas grew to understand the weapon, not just as a tool, but as a silent partner. He would sit for hours, meticulously cleaning it, the smell of gun oil a familiar comfort. He learned its quirks, its weight distribution, the feel of the checkered wooden grips against his palm. He learned to trust it, to believe in its power. For many, the rifle was the primary instrument of war, but the pistol was the personal one. It was the last line of defense, the one thing you held on to when the enemy was close enough to see the whites of their eyes. It was a secret, a quiet confidence carried on the hip. As the days blurred into weeks, Thomas and his fellow recruits transitioned from clumsy amateurs to soldiers who knew their weapon, who understood its grim purpose. They were no longer boys holding a gun. They were men preparing for a fight, and the 45 was their final personal shield. The war was no longer a distant headline. It was an approaching storm. And as they packed their bags and boarded the troop transports, the weight of the M1911 felt heavier than ever, a tangible connection to the unknown fate that awaited them across the sea. They were told it was the ultimate equalizer, but they had yet to discover if that was a promise or a lie. The ocean stretched out before them, an endless blue canvas upon which their destinies would soon be written. And the Colt 45 was a grim bookmark in the first chapter. The journey was long and monotonous, a gray procession of endless waves and crowded decks. Thomas spent his time staring out at the horizon, the pistol a constant presence at his side. He thought of his family, of the quiet fields of Kansas, and the stark reality of what lay ahead. Rumors flew through the ship's hold like frightened birds, stories of fierce fighting in North Africa, of German panzers and the ruthless efficiency of the Wehrmacht. The M1911, the 45, was a common thread in these tales. A sergeant, a veteran of a few skirmishes, told them, "It's the only thing that'll make a Kraut stop and think twice when he's coming for you. That first shot, it's gotta count." The words hung in the air, a mixture of boast and grave warning. The pistol wasn't a primary weapon, they all knew that. But in the tight confines of a foxhole, in the chaos of a broken charge, it was the only thing that mattered. It was a testament to the belief that every soldier, no matter their role, deserved a final chance. It wasn't about winning a battle. It was about surviving a moment. The men clutched their pistols at night, the cold metal a stark comfort in the dark. It was a connection to a violent world they were about to enter, a link to the brutal lessons they had yet to learn. They landed in Casablanca, the air hot and dusty, and the reality of war descended upon them like a heavy shroud. The training was over. Now it was time to put their faith in steel and lead. The next chapter would be written in blood and sand, and the Colt 45 would be a silent, ever-present witness to every single word. And for some, it would be the final period on their story. But who would get to use it first, and in what circumstances remained to be seen? The desert was a character of its own, a vast, indifferent expanse of sand and rock that chewed up men and machines alike. Thomas and his platoon found themselves thrust into the North African campaign, a chaotic dance of hit-and-run skirmishes against Rommel's Africa Corps. The heat was a constant, oppressive weight, and the sand found its way into everything, from their food to the intricate mechanisms of their rifles. But the M1911, with its simple, rugged design, held up. It was a testament to its engineering, a weapon built for abuse. Thomas found himself relying on it more than he ever thought he would. In the close quarters of a rocky ravine, a rifle was cumbersome. The pistol, however, was a swift, efficient tool. The first time he had to use it in combat was a blur of adrenaline and fear. They were ambushed by a small German patrol, the crack of Mausers and the stutter of an MP-40 cutting through the silence. His rifle was on the ground, knocked from his hands. A German soldier, no older than himself, lunged from behind a boulder. Thomas's hand moved on its own, a smooth, practiced motion. The 45 was in his grip, and he fired from the hip. The report was deafening, a sharp explosion in the confined space. The German soldier stumbled, the impact of the heavy 45 round a brutal, undeniable force. He fell, a look of shock frozen on his face. Thomas stood there, the pistol still smoking in his hand, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't like the movies. It was brutal and fast and terrifyingly final. The laughter of the German patrol, just moments before, was now a dead silence, replaced by the grim echoes of the fight. The pistol had done what it was designed to do, and Thomas had learned a grim lesson. It was a weapon not of offense, but of survival, and it had just saved his life. The experience changed him. The pistol was no longer just a piece of equipment. It was a ghost, a reminder of the life he had just taken. He cleaned it with a renewed sense of purpose, not just for the sake of maintenance, but almost as an act of penance. The weapon felt heavier now, its cold steel a burden as well as a comfort. Other soldiers had their own stories, their own encounters. A medic, a quiet man named Frank, told a hushed tale of using his 45 to fend off a rabid dog that had strayed too close to a wounded soldier. A tank commander, his face smeared with grease, spoke of using his to dispatch a German officer who had surrendered but was reaching for a hidden Luger. The M1911 was a silent partner in all these stories, a witness to the brutal, intimate moments of war. It wasn't a heroic symbol. It was a grim tool, a personal instrument of survival. Its reputation for stopping power wasn't a myth. It was a brutal physical reality. The massive 45 caliber round, with its low velocity and heavy weight, delivered a blunt, concussive blow that was devastating at close range. It wasn't a weapon for a firefight across a field. It was a weapon for the moments when a man was in a desperate, last-ditch struggle. The American soldiers, with their ingrained belief in self-reliance, found a kindred spirit in the rugged, no-nonsense design of the Colt. It was a reflection of their own character, reliable, powerful, and ready for a fight. As the North African campaign drew to a close, Thomas and his unit were among the first to see a different kind of fighting. They were part of the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky. The sand and heat were replaced by the rocky, mountainous terrain of the island. The fighting was fierce, a brutal slog through ancient villages and olive groves. The M1911 continued to prove its worth. In the tight, winding streets of a Sicilian town, a rifle was a liability. The pistol was a savior. Thomas's platoon was clearing a house, a tense, door-to-door progression. The building was eerily silent, the air thick with the dust of shattered plaster. As Thomas kicked open a bedroom door, he came face to face with a German soldier, his rifle pointed directly at him. There was no time to raise his own weapon. He drew the .45 and the world seemed to slow down. He saw the flicker of surprise in the German's eyes, the slight hesitation, and then a roar from his own pistol. The German staggered back, a look of disbelief on his face, before collapsing to the floor. The moment was over, a silent, brutal ballet of life and death. Thomas stood there, his arm still extended, the pistol a cold, heavy weight in his hand. The laughter of the German, just a moment before, was now a silent memory, a grim reminder of the brutal efficiency of the M1911. The campaign in Sicily was a stepping stone, a bloody proving ground for what was to come. They were heading for mainland Italy, where the fighting would be even more intense, and the Germans would be even more entrenched. And the Colt .45, the silent guardian of the American soldier, would be there for every step of the way, its reputation growing with every shot fired. But even a legend has its limits, and as they pushed deeper into Italy, they would face an enemy unlike any they had encountered before, an enemy that would test not only their resolve, but the very legend of the M1911 itself. The Italian campaign was a brutal grind, a long, bloody slog up the boot of Italy. The Germans, dug into the mountainous terrain, fought with a ferocity that was born of desperation and a deep-seated belief in their cause. The landscape was unforgiving, and the fighting was intimate and brutal, a far cry from the vast open spaces of North Africa. The M1911 became more than a last resort. It became a staple of survival in the close-quarters combat of bombed-out villages and narrow ravines. Thomas and his platoon were now seasoned veterans, their youthful innocence replaced by a weary, hardened resolve. They had seen too much, done too much, and the .45 on Thomas's hip was a grim tally of the lives and deaths that had come to define their war. He could field strip it in seconds, his fingers working with a practiced, almost surgical precision. He had a deep personal relationship with the weapon, a silent understanding born of shared trauma. He knew its weight, the subtle shift in its balance as the magazine emptied, the satisfying metallic click of a fresh one being seated. It was a tool, yes, but it was also a story, a chronicle of every desperate moment, every whispered prayer, and every defiant stand. The Colt had earned its reputation in the trenches of the Great War, and it was now cementing its legacy in the hills of Italy. One particularly grueling battle took place in the ruins of a small village. The Germans had turned the stone buildings into a fortress, and every window was a potential sniper's nest. Thomas's platoon was tasked with clearing a cluster of houses, a slow and agonizing process. As they moved through the rubble-strewn streets, a German soldier, a young paratrooper with a pale, haunted face, appeared from behind a shattered wall. He held a Luger, a beautiful, finely crafted pistol, and a smirk played on his lips. He raised it, a challenge in his eyes. Thomas, caught in the open, had no time to raise his rifle. His hand went for his sidearm, the familiar weight of the M1911 a comfort in the chaos. The German paratrooper fired first, a quick series of pops from his Luger, the rounds zipping past Thomas's head with a sound like angry bees. Thomas responded with a single thunderous roar from his .45. The German's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of profound shock as the heavy .45 round slammed into his chest. The force of the impact knocked him backward and he fell, his Luger clattering to the ground. The difference in the sounds in the result was stark. The Luger, a masterpiece of German engineering, was a precise and beautiful instrument. The .45 was a hammer, a brutal, no-nonsense tool that did its job with an undeniable finality. The American soldiers, with their utilitarian ethos, found a profound truth in this simple, brutal equation. The Colt wasn't about elegance or precision. It was about stopping power. It was about ending a fight, not prolonging it. The war in Italy continued to be a punishing affair. The men were tired, their uniforms ragged, their faces etched with the lines of stress and exhaustion. But the M1901 continued to be a constant companion, a reliable friend in the most desperate of times. It was a silent witness to countless acts of courage and desperation. A radio operator cut off from his unit, used his to fight off a patrol that had stumbled upon his position. A machine gunner, his weapon jammed, used his to buy his comrades precious seconds to escape a collapsing building. The stories whispered around the campfires only served to reinforce the legend of the Colt. It was the weapon of last resort, a silent prayer answered with a thunderous roar. But even a legend is not without its chinks. The heavy weight, the low magazine capacity, and the powerful recoil were all valid criticisms. Yet for the men who carried it, these were not flaws. They were characteristics. The weight was a sign of its solid construction. The low capacity forced them to make every shot count, and the recoil was a reminder of the power they held in their hands. As the fighting moved closer to Rome, the battles became even more intense, and the line between life and death grew thinner with every passing day. The M1911, the silent guardian of the American soldier, was a constant reminder that in war, a man's final moments are often his most personal, and as they prepared for the next, most crucial advance, they knew their trusty sidearm would be there for them, a grim promise whispered in the silence before the storm. But what would happen when the Colt, with all its legendary power, was no match for a new kind of terror? A terror that wasn't born of a soldier's hand, but of a machine's cold, merciless steel. The advance stalled. They were at the Anzio beachhead, trapped in a brutal stalemate, facing off against a desperate German counterattack. The landscape had become a moonscape of craters and shattered trees, a grim testament to the ferocity of the fighting. The war of attrition was a new kind of hell, and the M1911, with its short range and low magazine capacity, felt more like a symbolic gesture than a true weapon of war. But in the tight confines of the trenches, it still held its own. The Germans, with their well-coordinated attacks and their powerful panzers, were a relentless force. Thomas and his platoon were on the front lines, and the constant shelling and machine gun fire were a relentless assault on their minds and bodies. The laughter of the German soldiers, often heard during a lull in the fighting, was a chilling reminder of the enemy's confidence. Thomas gripped his .45, its cold weight a familiar comfort, a promise that he would not go down without a fight. The pistol had seen him through North Africa and Sicily, and it had been a silent witness to the brutal, intimate moments of the Italian campaign. It was a part of his story, and a part of the story of countless other soldiers. The battle for Anzio was a microcosm of the war itself. Moments of intense, close-quarters combat were followed by long periods of tense waiting, a grim test of patience and endurance. The M1911 was the weapon for those moments. A German patrol, on a dark night, stumbled upon Thomas's foxhole. There was no time for a rifle. The pistol, a quick, silent draw, was the only thing that mattered. The report was a deafening roar in the dark, and the German patrol, surprised and disoriented, scattered. The sound of the .45, the unmistakable crack of the heavy round, was a sound of defiance, a sound that said, "We are still here, and we will not break." It was a sound that had become synonymous with American resolve, a sound that had turned the laughter of the enemy into a horrified silence. But the war was changing. The Germans were introducing new weapons, more powerful and more terrifying than anything they had encountered before. They had seen the first of the German assault rifles, a revolutionary new weapon that could outmatch their own rifles and pistols. The M1911, with all its legendary stopping power, was no match for the rapid, sustained fire of an automatic weapon. It was a grim realization, a chink in the armor of their collective confidence. The war, which had once been a battle of men and their personal courage, was becoming a battle of technology and firepower. And in this new kind of war, the Colt, with all its history and all its legend, was starting to feel a little outmatched. The final German counterattack at Anzio was a sight of utter devastation. Panzer divisions, with their heavy guns and their thick armor, rolled across the battlefield, their treads chewing up the earth. The sky was filled with the screaming of shells, and the air was thick with the smell of cordite and death. Thomas and his platoon, huddled in a trench, watched in horror as a Tiger tank, a massive, unstoppable beast of steel, rolled towards them. The tank's machine gun, a coaxial-mounted MG-42, began to fire, a deafening, continuous roar of lead that cut through the air like a saw. The men were trapped, their rifles and pistols useless against the unyielding steel of the tank. The M1911, the weapon that had saved so many lives, was a useless piece of metal against this new kind of terror. Its legend, born of close-quarters combat and personal bravery, was shattered by the cold, impersonal brutality of a machine. It was a humbling and terrifying moment, a grim realization that the war was no longer about a man and his pistol. It was about the machines of war. The laughter of the German soldiers, just a few yards away, was a cruel, mocking sound, a sound that the Colt could not silence. But just as all hope seemed lost, a lone American soldier, an engineer with a satchel charge, emerged from a crater. The fate of Thomas's platoon and the silent, humbling legacy of the Colt rested on the shoulders of this one man and what he would do next. The laughter was about to be turned to silence, but not by a pistol. The satchel charge, a bundle of high explosives with a fuse, was the last-ditch effort. The engineer, a young man with a determined glint in his eye, scrambled from the crater, his body low to the ground. The Tiger tank, oblivious to the small figure, continued its relentless advance, its main gun traversing slowly, searching for a target. The German soldiers, their laughter echoing through the battlefield, were confident in their steel behemoth. Thomas, gripping his useless M1911, watched with a mixture of hope and dread. He had always believed in the power of the pistol, the intimate, personal defiance it represented. But here, against a machine of war, it was nothing. The engineer, his uniform covered in mud and grime, made it to the side of the tank. With a swift, practiced motion, he placed the satchel charge on the tank's side and scrambled back to cover, the fuse hissing ominously. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The German soldier's laughter, a sound of triumph and mockery, continued. Then a thunderous, earth-shattering roar. The satchel charge detonated, and the massive Tiger tank lurched to a halt, its turret twisted at an odd angle, smoke pouring from its vents. The laughter stopped. It was replaced by a grim, stunned silence. The engineer, covered in dirt and debris, crawled back to the trench, a grim smile on his face. He had done what the Colt and 100 other pistols could not. He had silenced the laughter of the enemy. The battle for Anzio continued for weeks, a punishing, brutal affair. The American forces eventually broke out, but the cost was staggering. The M1911, the legendary sidearm, had been a witness to it all. It had been the first weapon Thomas held, and it had been with him through the deserts of North Africa and the hills of Italy. It had saved his life and the lives of his friends. It was a tool, but it was also a story, a chronicle of the bravery and desperation of a generation of young men. The war was no longer a battle of personal courage. It was a war of logistics and technology. The M1901, with all its history and all its legacy, was a symbol of a different kind of war, a more intimate and personal kind of fight. But it was a legend for a reason. Its story wasn't just about its stopping power or its rugged reliability. It was about the men who carried it. It was about the radio operator who fended off a patrol, the medic who saved a life, the tank commander who fought to the last. It was about Thomas Miller, the farm boy from Kansas who became a man on the battlefields of Italy, the Colt a constant silent presence on his hip. It was a weapon of last resort, a symbol of personal defiance, a promise that even when all was lost, there was still one final card to play. The war would continue, but the legend of the Colt 45 would remain, a grim and beautiful testament to the men who carried it. As the war in Italy wound down and the focus shifted to the invasion of France, Thomas was given a new assignment. He was to train the next generation of soldiers, the young, fresh-faced kids who were now heading to the European theater of operations. He stood on the firing line, the M1911 in his hands, its weight a familiar comfort. He looked at the young recruits, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and excitement. He knew their journey was just beginning. He held up the pistol. "This ain't no toy," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "This is the last thing you want to use, but the first thing you need to know." He demonstrated the grip, the sight picture, the deliberate press of the trigger, just as his own drill sergeant had done so many years ago. But he added a new detail, a piece of wisdom born of his own brutal experience. This is the weapon that turns laughter into silence. It's a promise, a last-ditch defiance. Don't ever forget what it means. The young soldiers nodded, their eyes wide with a mixture of respect and trepidation. They were about to learn a brutal lesson, a lesson that had been forged in the crucible of war, a lesson that would be etched into their very souls. And the Colt, 45, the silent guardian of the American soldier, would be there to guide them, a grim and constant presence. But what would happen when they discovered that the laughter they were trying to silence wasn't coming from the enemy, but from within their own ranks, a nervous, desperate laugh that could only be stilled by the grim reality